Welcome to Have You Heard, where we talk about issues at the intersection of agriculture and engineering. Let's get started. Here are your hosts, Morgan Hayes and Josh Jackson.
Welcome to the Have You Heard podcast. This is episode number 8. We're going to start our show today with what's happening on the farms, and then we're going to discuss our hay feeding strategies. I'm Morgan Hayes. I'm an assistant professor in the Biosystems and Ag Engineering department at the University of Kentucky, focusing on livestock facilities. And my husband and I do farm in Boyle County, about 500 acres, a commercial cattle and hay operation there.
And I'm Josh Jackson, assistant professor in Ag Engineering, focusing on precision livestock farming. I farm in Mercer County, focus on hay production and raising some Angus cattle.
Okay, Josh. So, we had Matt Dixon on for a delayed last week's podcast that actually came out earlier this week. And we talked a little bit about what had happened on our farm in December and through the new year, but maybe we'll dig in a little bit more today on some of the big happenings on the farm over the last couple weeks and anything this week that you're working on.
So I mentioned, in the last podcast, we did apply some lime. The other thing that was done by one of the brothers was we actually went ahead and did some of our vaccinations for the calves. So got some of the vaccinations knocked out, and then also working on equipment. So we have a baler that's needing some belts and some other repairs and maintenance done. So also a good time of the year when we don't need equipment, we're working on trying to make it functional. And also our skid steer has been down since November, so that's made which we're going to talk about today, our feeding hay a little more difficult.
Oh yeah, absolutely. When there's a piece of equipment down, it really is pretty challenging to get everything up and going the way you need to. So I mentioned last time we did get some manure spread. That for us is a big deal because as we go into our winter feeding, we do use some concrete feeding pads and we do have to scrape that manure. And so some of that manure that was stockpiled, we did finally get out here late in the fall. It was a pretty wet fall, and a couple of the opportunities that we would have had to do some manure spreading, we were focused on fencing instead earlier in the fall. So that was our big opportunity to get some cleared space out there. Aside from that, other things that we've been working on, sort of similar to you, we have some equipment that needs maintenance. So that's been a big deal. We've been fighting issues with our cattle. So we had a cow die in December sort of randomly, and that's never a good sign, a young cow out of nowhere. So we now have a younger calf that we're feeding separately and doing some different things just to manage our herd. But overall, I think it's been a pretty good end of the year. We had a lot of productivity on our grasses. We finally started feeding hay to our spring group on Christmas Eve.
Okay.
So that was the first hay that went out to our spring group, which is a pretty good stretch for us before we had to feed any hay.
Yeah, that's amazing. Especially for this, this area, being able to feed to December. Usually get to November, and that's about it.
Yeah, normally I would expect to get to November or into November on most of our groups, but December 24th is really a positive, and we even moved some cattle onto the farm so that we were done then. If we had left the same stocking density we'd had over the summer, we would have been able to probably graze into January. So
wow.
So that's really, I guess that's a really good thing. Now we're sort of figuring out if we have to move some cattle around just to put animals where the right feeding pads are, which leads us perfectly into today's discussion, which is hay feeding strategies.
Yep.
Types of hay that we're feeding, how we're feeding it, and our approach and theory for why we're doing that.
So for our farm, what we kind of focus on is a big 5x6 bales. We can 2 4x5s will equal 1 5x6. So for us, it's about handling fewer bales. We handle bigger bales, or use bigger bales just so we can have to handle them less frequently. We haven't really touched any of our hay that's in the barn. So we had a lot of hay that was stored outside because we had an ample supply this year. So a lot of our hay was actually stored outside, so we were trying to feed that up. So usually we do first in, first out, but this year we have some flexibility. A lot of outdoor hay still trying to feed. We could probably make it to the end of January before we actually touch anything in our barns. And if we have our calves, our calves will get whatever's in the barn, whatever we believe to be, or whatever's been shown to be our highest quality hay.
And these are your calves that you have just weaned?
So we have, this is for most of our cows are cows with calves. They are on, they're getting hay from outdoor, or we had our soybean bales were stored outside because we didn't have the room for them because we had that much hay. And so feeding that still and feeding some other just grass hay that we had from our second cutting.
Okay.
So that's our fall cow. Our spring cows, they're on a different farm. And so they actually they're being fed hay that's been stored from the first and second cuttings inside.
Okay.
And they're fed with a 2-wheel drive open station tractor. So it's whatever, when we actually have a hay geotextile fabric pad out for them. Our other cows, that's where I was talking about the skid steer being a problem this year. We have a hay feeding barn. And so it's actually, designed, we had it optimized for the skid steer to go down that row and clean out and to put bales in. But with the skid steer being down, right now it's just going out in the field in hay rings.
Okay. Is that your tractors are all too wide to fit in the...
A little too wide to fit inside that alley just for that. Because we'd actually narrowed it down, designed it to be wide enough for our big John Deere tractor, but had to narrow it down, made it for the skid so the cows could reach all the way to the center.
Yeah, this is one of the questions. We have what we call a winter feeding structure, concrete structure. In this state, we use the term Bo Renfro. That's a person in our NRCS in the state who did some work on this design, and it's known as the Bo Renfro structure. A lot of times, sort of anecdotally, that's how it's known. And it essentially is a concrete pad with a feed alley down the center and then gates or some form of panels on the outside walls so that the animals can be contained on this pad so they don't come on and off everywhere. And it prevents there from being a lot of erosion and disturbance of the soils around the pad other than the limited access alleyways on and off at the ends of the pad. And the style of the feeding alley varies a little bit. So there is a standard size that's about an 8-foot width, which is perfect for bringing equipment in to load the hay. The challenge is that when the cows eat, they can only eat in about 3 feet on both sides, maybe 3.5. There's at least 1.5 feet in the center that typically doesn't get eaten and has to be forked out. So there is some benefit with the skid steer, which is just over 6 foot wide. Most skid steers are a little bit narrower. We can use a slightly narrower design, and then we don't have to fork out of the center.
And even when we do, occasionally you put a bale in there you thought was good, then apparently it wasn't good. Because you occasionally get, just one that was maybe you baled by a stream, you baled a wet spot in the field. I have other brothers, so that got mixed in with all the rest of the bale. So I myself am guilty as well. I don't want to put it all on them. I myself am guilty.
I was going to say, are they the only ones that bale bad hay?
I was like, they're not the. I wish that were true, but everybody, you bale it. Somebody else bales it. Justin usually bales. My other brother Justin bales. I'll move and rake, and so we're all guilty. Yeah. And it'll make it in there. So we actually have a grapple it's designed to pretty much the width of our grapple is the width of that alley. So we can just go in there and remove the bad hay or whatever hay they're not eating, and then put a new bale in.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so one thing we do have in common is we both have what's known as that Bo Renfro structure on some of our farms. So I have my spring group that is now on hay. We have that Bo Renfro structure, and we do feed hay in that alley, and that's where the cows are currently eating from our spring calving group. I will say that we also unroll hay to that group because we have them in a winter sacrifice lot. When the weather is good enough, when it's frozen ground, the last couple mornings we've been able to go out and unroll hay. Our strategy is if we unroll hay, we want to unroll at least what's going to be cleaned up in 24 hours or possibly less.
Okay. Do you still have hay in rings at that time?
We do not. We do not ever put hay out in rings on this site. This is a sacrifice field, but in order to get nutrients where we want them in our sacrifice field, we will unroll on the back side of the field on the hillside, or we will force them to come up to the front side of the pen, which is where the feeding structure is.
Okay.
And so really we're using that as a strategy to try and move some nutrients around in that sacrifice lot, and also just to take out wear and tear up near the feeding structure. It just provides us a little bit more structured ground there, so when the ground starts to get wet, it has a little more structure underneath it to shed some water before it starts to really get sloppy, which still happens even with those structures and a pathway getting onto it that's rocked up. There's somewhere where the rock stops and the mud starts, and that happens on all of these structures. So for that farm, that is our approach. Our calves that we weaned from our spring group are currently in a barn, but they are fed hay as well. Now for them, we actually have something that's almost a modification of that design where we have them eating on concrete through feed panels, but we unroll our hay to those animals. And our strategy with that is that we think that they actually eat a little bit better, especially in weaning and early days on hay with the softer hay. With those hard round bales, one, those smaller animals can't reach that far in to get to the bale, but two, they tend to be more interested in picking through it. We force them to clean up quite a bit of it, and they get feed on top of it, so they're certainly not lacking in nutrition, but we will make them clean up those bales. But they also get to work at eating sort of continuously because we have plenty of space at that feeder, so everyone gets their own feed stall, so that's kind of interesting. And then our fall group is a challenge.
And what kind of bales are you feeding? You said you're unrolling it. What size of bales?
All of our bales are 4x5.
Okay.
We have some smaller bales, some 4x4s that we sell to people that manually unroll them. So from a selling perspective, we sell some smaller bales that are lighter in weight, specifically for people that don't have the equipment to unroll.
Right.
But we would want a 4x5. That is what our roller is designed to do. That's the capacity of it. And we actually choose the 4x5 because of the width. So where your 5x6s make you a 10-foot wide when you're hauling hay, we are only ever 8-foot wide. And because we sell hay, we purchased a roller that would make it feasible for us to go on the road with everything up on the trailer safely inside that 8-foot limit. Now, right now in the state of Kentucky, I don't think there's a lot of pressure for people hauling hay at 10-foot wide. But you could always get into some challenging situations depending on where you are.
Mailboxes.
With mailboxes, or even with local police and things like that, if you're really too wide on a narrower road, making things challenging for passing. So we've just chosen for ease and convenience of transport, especially when we're selling hay, to stay with a 4x5 roll.
Makes a lot of sense. And it works good for unrolling. What do you use to unroll it with? Do you unroll with a skid steer, tractor? Or?
We have two unrollers. They're hydraulic unrollers. One fits on the front end of a skid steer or a tractor loader, as long as it has a skid steer attachment on it. The other one we have actually mounted so it's on our 3-point attachment on the rear of a tractor. So we can unroll with both the skid steer or a tractor. And our Bo Renfro design, if we ever want to move our tractors in, our smaller Kubotas, our 50-ish horse Kubota will go into it, and our skid steer will go into it. Our larger tractor we can fit into there, but that's really tight. Our 65, 70 horse tractors is a very tight fit, but we have about a 7-foot width inside of posts, so we can actually get our tractors in if we need to.
Okay.
Oh, I didn't get to my last farm here. I know I had a lot of farms that I had talked about my hay feeding strategies on, but the last farm is really a trick because we feed at a leased piece of land. And so this facility doesn't really have any sort of feeding structures. There's no concrete, there's no heavy use pads, there's no real place to feed efficiently. So we do a couple things. We do unroll hay. We place hay out in just full-size bales. We don't actually put it in rings. We've found that hasn't really helped us a lot with efficiency on the feeding, but we feed every day.
Okay. Every day, yeah.
And we will sometimes bale graze. We'll do all three things on this farm.
So, like, we have, I think I was talking to Matt Dixon this morning, look at the GFS model, showing some potential for snow. He was talking either nothing or 10 inches for Sunday. And so I was thinking, it's like, well, maybe it's a good time to throw out some extra bales. Hey, you put out extra bales, I guess that's when you do bale grazing.
So we have two fields that we feed in. We have our traditional sacrifice field. That's where our water tank is. That's where all these other things are. But we can access the water tank from a second field. So in our primary sacrifice field, we will unroll hay or set out bales in full bale form. But we'll plan to go out every day and do that. Because we're trying to reduce wastage. All of our hay is stored inside, other than a few rolls that are out at this farm that are just sort of stockpiled out there. The majority of our hay is stored in barns, so we don't want to waste any more than we have to because we've spent a lot of time and energy maintaining that hay and the quality of it. So that hay is usually out every morning, mid-morning.
Okay.
The hay that we would put out if we were bale grazing, and we do currently have about 20 days of hay currently set up out there. And we try and maintain about that amount because we assume that in 20 days we're going to get a dry enough day that we can restock that if for some reason we get into a very wet period.
Right.
So that hay is out already, and if we need it, we will be able to turn them out on Sunday onto that hay with the frozen ground.
Okay. Well, that's something we try to plan for. If it's the weather's getting ready to turn on us, we try to put out ample supply of hay. So we have a couple bales where it'll be lower quality. So we don't put them in hay rings, and we try to build a shelter almost for them in the field, just where they can tear up hay bales and find somewhere to lie. Is that what you guys try to do with this farm and all your farms, or what? What do you do on those days when it's going to turn cold or get windy or freezing rain? I know those can be some challenging days for feeding hay.
Yeah, so the leased piece of land actually has tremendous tree cover. It's not a great piece of property for many things, but for winter weather, it's exceptionally good. We actually have very good protection for the cattle. They can get out of weather fairly efficiently, get away from wind. Even if it's snowing, they can get out of the majority of it. They're not going to avoid it completely, but snow is not usually a huge problem. It's the ice that's more problematic, and they can find protection from a lot of that weather. And we do typically put out like a line of hay or something like that if we know they're going to come into that. So 5 to 10 rolls in a row, and we know that they're going to tear those up and not use them as efficiently. But we leave those out for that type of weather specifically so they have something to lie on if they need it as that weather sort of develops. The farm that we have, the Bow Renfro structure, our spring group, we will typically in February and March, especially in March as we start to calve, we will give them possibly access to one of the barns. Okay. One of our hay barns as we clear out the hay, and that's only hay that we ourselves are feeding. We wouldn't put them into our barn where we're selling hay, but we don't typically give the cows that access. Only when we start to have calving happen that we will start giving access to that barn.
Okay. Get some of those calves protected.
Yeah, I'm not usually typically that worried about my cows. They're in good body condition. They're getting plenty of energy from hay, and then they can get feed supplemented if it's really cold or stressful for them. But when we start to see young calves on the ground in the spring, that's when I start thinking about some protection.
Okay. Yeah, I know it's about that time of year to start thinking about, even giving the E. coli vaccine. I know that's something we do.
Yeah.
And we're about 60 days out to start giving that vaccine. I think you guys do that as well, don't you? Or?
Sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. We haven't found that we've really ever used it or had any real issues with our fall calving herd, so we've never done that. And sometimes we'll use it in our spring herd, but sometimes only just on some heifers.
Okay.
I'm not usually as concerned. My cows tend to do a pretty good job mothering, and I haven't ever really had a lot of scouring issues on our farm. But sometimes the heifers that have a little bit lower quality colostrum, it really does actually provide a huge boost to them and their ability to provide some immunity to the calves.
I know we had some late calvers one year, and they seemed to really struggle with E. coli. So that's why we went to that, using E. coli just across the board, because we wanted to prevent a lot of issues. So the less we have to touch the calf, the better.
Absolutely, yeah. Anytime you're having challenges like that, it's a big problem. So with your boat, you have a feeding structure, but it's covered as well. How do you find that covering works? Does it help you protect your hay?
It does protect the hay. So a lot of it is just making sure we put, the high quality hay in there so that they can eat it down. Through a couple of Johnson grass bales that were maybe a little overly mature. Yeah, they're going to leave some of that material there. And so that's where you have to get in there with the skid steer and possibly clean it out. So really, just focusing on where we have that structure, feeding high quality hay. The wind still does blow through the structure, but it definitely, I think, maintains quality of the hay that we feed there. Because if you're feeding it outdoors, they might not eat it all the way down. And we're really also trying to put out, we do that. I think we can put out a total of 10 bales at a time. So for us, it's just about putting it at the beginning of the week or at a convenient time, putting out ample supply of bales for it just to be readily available to the cows.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is really great about hay feeding, especially with these concrete and even the heavy use, is that I don't take my tractor off into the mud.
Yes.
So I'm not tracking mud back into my hay barns. And for me, this is a really big deal because I sell quite a bit of hay. So the last thing I want to do is bring organic matter into my heavily rocked hay barns, and then have moisture basically build up and sit on the bottom of bales, and that's what causes a lot of the discoloration and some of the surface molding on those bales. So that's a really big deal that we can now feed at most of our sites without taking our tractors out in the mud. It resolves a lot of issues for us.
Yeah, because but prior to this, maybe I think there was a picture going through. I think Matt Dixon even had on one of his, not his podcast, but one of his demonstrations where the cattle are in mud. So this was in February 2016 or so, when we had a lot of rain, a lot of moisture. So we're still feeding cattle without a pad at that point. And so it was just, on top of a hill, we were still seeing a lot of issues with moisture and ruts going through the field. So we can save a lot of time and energy going through and reseeding, disking, reseeding, just taking care of what we have and feeding on a feeding pad. I mean, I've put a rock pad from my barn all the way to my feeding pad just because it makes that much of a difference as far as you're not sinking down in the mud.
Yeah, I think it protects both the tractor, the cattle, but it also, I think protects the environment, the soils.
A lot less runoff.
Yep. So that's a really good thing. So with that, Josh, let's jump back over and just talk about what we're preparing to do for the next week or so on the farms.
So next week or so, like I mentioned a little before, we're going to probably look at doing the E. coli vaccine for our spring herd. Probably looking to weigh calves, just making sure everything is they're still gaining the way we want them to. And actually getting ready to think about weaning. February is coming up here for us. And so that's when we're getting ready to, pretty much after farm show or during farm show, we're going to wean our calves.
Okay.
How about you?
Yeah, I will not be weaning my calves at farm show. Typically, we try and wean the second week of March. We've had discussions about maybe aiming for March 1 this year. We had a very early, very successful fall calving. We had 85% in the first month. So by March 1, we will definitely have everything at 6 months on average in our herd. So that's really not a bad thing for us. That means we can wean a little bit earlier and take a little bit of stress on those cows that are on that lot that isn't really as ideal for feeding, that we're working a little bit harder at feeding them on. So that would be good. But the things that we really have to get done is the bulls come out this week. So for us, we do a 60-day calving window, and they go in November 15th, so they come out January 15th. So they will be coming out. And then other things that we have to do is just continue our maintenance on our equipment. We're going to do a little bit of work on the baler, just try and check some bearings and things like that, make sure there's no real issues going on.
It always takes a little more time than you think it should, but probably about 3 times as long as it should. But
you got to do that.
You got to do it though. It's a necessary evil.
Absolutely. And with that, we'll end everything for today. But if anyone has any questions for us about hay feeding, just let us know.
Have You Heard is a production of the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food and Environment, along with the Department of Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering. Discover what's wildly possible at ca.uky.edu.